The 2026 International Colloquium Series Europe is sponsored by the Episcopal Diocese of California, the Tabernacle Community Development Corporation, the Waters Living Trust, and Grace Cathedral in San Francisco. With university sponsors, Pepperdine University, the University of Geneva, the Graduate Theological Union, the Catholic University of Leuven, and the Catholic University of Lyon. And community partners, the Cathedral Church of the Holy Trinity, the American Cathedral in Paris, the Chemin Neuf Community in France, Emmanuel Episcopal Church of Geneva, the Center for Liberation Theologies at the Catholic University of Leuven, and the French-speaking Institute of Systematic Theology and Ethics at the University of Geneva. With the 2026 hotel partner, Nest M Gallery, Paris La Défense, an Accor luxury hotel. And special thanks to the following: Dr. Christophe Chalamet, Dr. Estelle Sogbu, Dr. Judith Gruber, Dr. Dara Straub, Kim Powell, Dr. Anne-Marie Reinen, Dr. Raymond Carr, Dr. Valerie Miles-Tribble, and Colette Rogers-Griselle.
The Northern California Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Community Foundation is dedicated to promoting justice, health, education, and service. Please consider making a donation at norcalmlkfoundation.org. Every donation makes a difference.
I want to begin with a quote. This quote is from a Greek poet by the name of Archilochus. Sometimes it's called a dark fragment, and it ties to the title that you see that was advertised. That title can be two things. On one hand, it could be something called Signifying Monk, which is a play off of an old folk tale called The Signifying Monkey. I do my work on the jazz theologian by the name of Thelonious Monk, and I use it to talk about theology. And so it's a kind of playful theology. But this title that you saw online was Hedgehogs, Foxes, and Rabbits: The Spirit of Freedom in the Theologies of Karl, Barth, and Thomas Merton. So I want to quote this quote from Archilochus, and then we'll go into the conversation, all right? It reads like this: "The fox knows many things, but the hedgehog knows one big thing." And that was taken up into a book by a scholar by the name of Isaiah Berlin. He wrote this book called The Hedgehog and the Fox. And he used it to talk about two different kinds of thinkers. The hedgehog, who tends to focus on one thing, primarily its defense, and the fox that kind of roams about. And he says these are the kind of classifications. Now, we're adding something to that. We're going to add the rabbit. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to first read the abstract to this short paper, because I planned for it to be short. And then I was hoping that we could turn to something else here. We may be able to look at a couple of these slides, and then we'll close it out, all right? So I want to read it to you first. "The theologies of Karl Barth, Thomas Merton, and James Cone represent an opportunity to interrogate their respective theologies and critical relationships to the Christian church and its relationship to post-secular realities. Using the metaphor of the hedgehog and the fox from Archilochus, the Grecian poet, and the metaphor of the rabbit, in particular Brer Rabbit, the trickster from James H. Cone, I will suggest reinterpretations grounded in complementarity, where Barth, like a hedgehog, anchors theology in a revolutionary Christological concentration aimed at the mystery of God, and Merton, like a fox, remains critically engaged in emancipatory spirituality, demonstrating great scope and versatility in multi-dialogical conversations on the periphery of Christian faith. When freely exchanged and engaged by distinctive emphases from the African-American mode of aesthetic apprehension, Cone's engagement will illuminate and enliven the prophetic impulse of Barth and Merton and the church, and perhaps prefigure a wholeness beyond our fragmentation in the 21st century. Let me say this in a different way. While Barth aims at the center, Merton plays on the periphery. But Cone takes up a position on the periphery that in some ways focuses on the center. That's the way they work together. Now, I was really hoping that we could see that Toni Morrison clip, but if we can't, we'll skip it, okay? But let me read. Thomas Merton was a Catholic theologian who disavowed any form of theological professionalism by describing himself as not being a pro. I'm not a pro, he writes. Later in his discussion with Rosemary Radford Ruther, an American feminist theologian, he makes a similar statement in relationship to the vocation of a theologian. First, he was talking about a biblical scholar. He wrote this book. I hope you buy this book, especially you Catholics, called Opening the Bible. Wonderful piece by Thomas Merton. I use it in my classes. So it's a provocative statement which generates a bevy of questions, such as, is Merton merely being disingenuous since he's writing books on the subject? Is he setting in relief the exclusivity of professional theologians from his own more inclusive vocational sensibilities? Is he simply criticizing the limitations of professional scholars? Merton nevertheless continues, writing that he has not even been reading monastic literature, but rather, quote, working on Faulkner and writing on Camus, and I suppose, again, sneaking out the back door of the church without telling myself that this is what I'm doing, close quote. Merton's pithy elaboration to Ruther illustrates one of the possible reasons he establishes personal distance from professional theologians, because he was so, quote, at home in the world. That's the name of the book that they wrote together. They both were at home in the world in a certain way. He adopted a critical relationship to theologians and their preoccupations with monastic literature or ecclesiastical sources or dogmatic parameters. When you study the history of Thomas Merton, one of the things you'll find out that he left the clubs to go into the monastery. And when he got in the monastery, he left the monastery to go into a hermitage. And I figured if Merton had continued to live, he would have left the hermitage to go somewhere else. He was constantly moving in a way to gain perspective on the world. By contrast, through utilizing cultural sources to deepen his existential engagement with the truth, he demonstrates profound theological insight and scope. Even a cursory familiarity with Merton reveals his profound engagement with literary artists akin to Faulkner and philosophical thinkers like Camus, who represent only a fraction of the extensive modern and contemporary sources he interrogates. And by extending his range with such thinkers, Merton sharpens his insight into faith by expanding dialogically in conversation with many interlocutors, freely celebrating truth as it emerges from viewpoints, quote, outside frameworks of the church. By the way, Karl Barth will call it the church, approaching the church extramuros ecclesia, meaning outside the walls of the church. James Cone called it secular parables. James Cone called it secular parables. Cone called it secular spirituals. But they're talking about the same kinds of things outside the walls of the church. And when understood in light of the metaphor used throughout this article, Merton identifies figuratively as a fox. That is, as one who exercises a radical, open spiritual vision in the world, a willingness to venture out and engage in multi-dialogical conversations beyond mere dualisms, repristinating while transcending prototypical categories in theology. To be sure, Merton's vocation as a Trappist monk who paradoxically demonstrates comfort with Buddhists, Taoists, existentialists, civil rights advocates, poets, atheists, feminist scholars, humanists, aesthetes of various stripes, stands as the most significant witness to his fox-like sensibilities. I've always seen Merton as in some way on the border in a way that opens the door of the Catholic Church to others. Hope you'll see him that way also. Coexistence beyond the hedgehog and the fox. So what does this have to do with Karl Barth, the grand Protestant theologian of the 20th century, the hedgehog in our figurative title? Answering this question in light of Achilles' pedagogical aphorism offers an illuminative direction to our theologizing. Achilles' line, the fox knows many things, but the hedgehog knows one big thing, dialogically reorganizes our perceptions about how the contributions of thinkers with various talents, spiritual gifts, and locations can encourage the church, provided we mind Isaiah Berlin's caveat to avoid rigid classifications. Indeed, Barth's and Merton's respective theologies can function as an agency of meaning or an intellectus for establishing a noumenological Christology, that is, a Christology grounded vision which opens up to a radical spiritual freedom, or what might be called the black spirit of the crucified Christ. I'll talk more about that in a minute. The hedgehog and the fox metaphor, as Berlin acknowledges, stands figuratively as, quote, a dark words. And when one listens for complementarity between hedgehogs and foxes, one gains insight into the promiscuity of their continuity and contributions to an irregular theology. That's Barth's language. Barth talks about irregular theology, which is theology that comes from different places. And then he talks about regular theology, which is like dogmatics. Okay? So we gain insight into a kind of irregular theology, rather than highlighting radical distinctions between these various thinkers and writers or human beings in general. Speaking metaphorically, we may best consider Barth, Merton, and Cone, who I'll mention shortly, theologically, the way best to do this is to think of them as theologians whose unity emerges from the work of Christ and the foundations of the gospel. In this way, the ontological priority of Christ speaks to the antinomies in creation without overdetermining the cosmos. Moreover, because Merton was slowly, quote, being drawn more deeply into the heart of Barth's theology, close quote, and there's a theology behind that. There's a reason for that. There's this Czech theologian by the name of Jan Lachman, who deepened Merton's understanding of Barth, more radical vision of Barth than you'll get in America and even in certain places in Europe, okay? But that's for another conversation. Indeed, to merely highlight the radical discontinuity between hedgehogs and foxes, particularly with relationship to the task of theology, does violence to the fox and Barth and the hedgehog and Merton, and unwittingly eclipse their distinctive contributions by misunderstanding their complementarity when read together. In any event, and by the way, I chose to do a Catholic because I knew I was coming to this Catholic space. I don't normally add Merton to this work, all right? I did this for you. And by the way, there is a Thomas Merton Society here, and I used to be on the board of the Thomas Merton Society. So it's one of the reasons why I wanted to really share this with you. In any event, it is clear that Barth concentrates on Christology in a hedgehog-like manner, even as Merton continually increases his spiritual range, dialogically like a fox. Their theological visions of Christ and the Holy Spirit coincide like counter melodies in the form of a cantus firmus. By the way, Dietrich Bonhoeffer used that term, Karl Barth also used that term, and my friend Thelonious Monk played his music on a cantus firmus. That means a fixed melody that opens up possibilities. That is a pre-existing melody on which to build. Barth's Christology, Merton's emancipatory spirituality can be heard together as two melodies. In his revolutionary Christological concentration, Barth sees Christ objectively as representative of all humanity. Christ is the rejected and the accepted one, the object and the subject. Barth's position, of course, criticizes any theological vision which would unmoor spirituality from Christ as the foundation and connect faith to an amorphously understood modern zeitgeist, or a spirituality without a dimension of depth reflective of Christ's inclusivity. This would include any form of Christocentrism or Christomonism, which Barth was often accused of advocating. Christomonism is when you reduce everything to only Jesus and it becomes a kind of a negative exclusivity. That's not Karl Barth's theology. Let me keep reading. On the other hand, because Merton resists any theological vision that would understand the life of the church as being isolated from an emancipatory spirituality, the idea of, quote, returning to the Father, which is a common Catholic language and Christian language, takes on a paradoxical meaning since the Son sends his Spirit not to go back into time, this is a quote from Merton, to roll up the scroll of history or to reverse anything. It is a going forward, a going beyond, close quote. Returning for Merton is therefore going forward in an enthusiastic embrace of the future. I hope your theology will do that. Such complementarity between Barth and Merton transcends happenstances associated with their theological endeavors and their lives, such as their common death on December 10th, 1968. They both died on the same day. Mm-hmm. Merton was in Bangkok, Barth was at home, just like a hedgehog and a fox. And it presses us to to more important and underdeveloped areas of Merton's studies. His preoccupations with the heart of Barth's theological vision, which clearly develops over time. His shifts from his earlier, more negative positions about Protestant theologians. In lieu of offering an apologetic argument for Barth, I would rather accent the ground tones of Barth's theological vision and complement it on one hand with Merton's prodigality. The interchange permits Barth's Christological concentration to have its proper telos in a numerological expansion into the creatorial sphere. I hope you hear that. A Christological concentration that gives way to a numerological expansion. Thus Barth's focus on the mysterious center as the peculiar center of gravity extends toward its own proper goal of a centrifugal movement through the agency of the Holy Spirit, outward toward the periphery and into the common life of the world, or as Barth may prefer to say, into the external ground of the covenant, he called it. And in this way, his theology, or so-called Christ-centered exclusivity, proves itself to be foundational for a radical and dynamically inclusive engagement with various religions, philosophies, and literary traditions modeled by Merton, rather than narrow, isolating exclusivity. Might even include, this is Barth's book on Mozart, where he sees Mozart as a secular parable. Okay? Barth's universal orientation is objectively grounded in the incarnation, but subjectively actualized in the Spirit's work, or what George Hunsinger identifies as a Christ-centered pneumatology, which I prefer to call a numerological Christology. Positively understood, God could be construed as being radically related to all history, a God who, quote, governs all things, close quote, and gives the world a cosmic density. And because of God's governing agency, the whole world, the whole realm of being becomes the, quote, the theater and instrument of his righteous action, the mirror and echo of his living word, the parable of the kingdom of heaven, close quote. From this perspective, all of creation is called a service, and the entire cosmos becomes a parable. Barth's theological orientation of the God of creation criticizes any strict identification between human movements and the movement of God. Now, the prophetic impulse in Barth and Cone, in Merton and Barth and Cone. So again, on hedgehogs, foxes, and rabbits. The prophetic impulse in Barth and Merton can be seen in its metaphor that describes the complementarity between these two. Because in my view, no American theologian offers an emancipatory spirituality that complements Barth's Christological concentration more than the radical, multi-dialogical, and multi-religious engagement engendered by James Cone. And when read in concert with Barth and Merton, a kind of embryonic prophetic word for the 21st century church emerges. This metacritical prophetic orientation in Cone can be described from several perspectives. So let me share how I turn to this more embryonic approach here. I'll just share one or two things here. Again, I really wanted to play that, but since it's not going to play, it's not working, right? Yeah, we'll keep it moving. So when we talk about, again, the rabbit, which is going to be, again, on this periphery in some way, here's what Cone sort of says about this positionality. I just want you to hear a little bit here. All right. He said, again, this idea of the rabbit is very similar. It's called Brer Rabbit because what these rabbits do is very similar to what the signifying monkey does. It uses its cunning to overcome power. And so Cone said this about this rabbit. He said, what slave masters would have recognized that the tales of Brer Rabbit and triumphs over the stronger animals actually expressed black slaves' conscious hopes and dreams of overcoming the slave masters themselves. See, they saw this as a way of hope. And then the thing I want you to catch about this is also Cone including folklore. And you'll see this when he writes his book called The Spirituals and the Blues. So Barth wakes up every morning to Mozart. The day he died, his wife had walked in the room to put on Mozart, right? It's a book on Mozart. Cone writes a book on the Spirituals and the Blues, okay? So now, when you start to think about Thelonious Monk, I wrote this book, there's actually 3, to bring Barth and Cone back together and have that conversation. That's why it's Theology in the Mode of Monk, all right? And so I want you to be kind of aware of how I'm bringing this together. So here's what Cone says. I'm going to just give you a couple things. We may say something about this play, and then we'll close. Here's what Cone said about his relationship to theology today. And again, think of it like a rabbit. Think of it like someone signifying, someone turning power. Here's what he said. When I listen to and observe black musicians singing and playing their instruments, bodies moving and swaying, they inspire me to write systematic theology the way they sang and played. The way black bodies moved, getting funky, like funk is going out of style. I listened to their cadence, the beat, the sound, and tone, and then tried to capture what they did in words. European theologians were too rational and abstract to understand what was happening in black experience. They knew nothing about funk. By the way, when you watch Toni Morris, can you go forward? I just want to see the picture real quick. Yeah, when you go forward on this, I had this wonderful quote from Toni Morrison that actually coincides with James Cone, where Morrison talks about that when she wanted to learn about theology, when she wanted to deepen her literature, she went to musicians because they were not concerned about the white gaze. And then after they influenced her, she said she took up a position on the border and made it the center and watched the literary world move around her. That's what happens with James Cone. Very similar, okay? And so part of what we're going to see here, and again, we're going to have to, we didn't get that thing here with, can we?
We're looking for a specific quote.
You know, it was a picture of Morrison that.
Yes,
but this is where Morrison would have played for you. Maybe at some other point, all right? Now, I want you to go to this next part on play. And I'm going to say a couple of things again. We're going to close out with this part on play. Can you find that? Yeah. All right. So notice this idea. This is we've skipped forward, but Monk played in the tension. And I want you to catch this. Monk always played in the tension. But let me say, so when we look at James Cone, here's something else he said. And I want you to see how he makes this clear in his posthumously released memoirs. He said, I wasn't writing for rational reasons, based on literary research, library research. I was writing out of my experience, speaking for the dignity of black people in a white supremacist world. I was on a mission to transform self-loathing Negro Christians into black-loving revolutionary disciples of Christ. I was singing a new theological song, a blues song, messing with theology the way B.B. King messed with music. I used Barth's theology as a way. I used Barth's theology the way B.B. King uses guitar, and Ray Charles used the piano. I had my mojo working as I danced the way I let my flesh and bones dance. I wasn't following Barth. He was simply the instrument that I played and left behind when it got in my way. Very similar when you study Blues People by Leroy Jones, you'll find out one of the points he makes is that jazz artists played on European instruments. Cone is playing on Barth, a European instrument who allows him to do what he wants to do. Mm-hmm. Now I want to close here. I'm going to say one or two things about Thelonious Monk and play, because we obviously can't get our stuff working, but that's all right. We're going to keep the mojo working anyway. Now, I just said a couple of things about Monk that I want you to know about, and then we'll close. It gives me great pleasure to talk to you about Monk because he's one of my favorite jazz artists. His name is Thelonious Steer Monk. He was born in 1917, died in 1982 on my birthday. Monk was affectionately known as the High Priest of Bebop. He was a brilliant pianist who emerged on the jazz scene during one of the most generative periods in jazz history. It was a revolutionary period called the Bebop era. It is a genre of jazz that had its heyday in the mid-1940s, and it was characterized by a kind of digital dexterity, epitomized by artists like Dizzy Gillespie and Charlie Bird Parker. Now, the thing about Monk that you want to know is that the bebop period was a revolutionary period, but Monk was a revolution within the revolution. Mm-hmm. When they're playing fast, Monk is going, ding, ding, very deliberate player. Space, he's emphasizing he's playing with flat fingers, which you're supposed to play like a cat. Okay? He's breaking conventions, all kinds of conventions, the way he dressed, the way he moved. Even when you look at the way Monk, again, would improvise on the melody, he had a kind of rhythmic displacement. And what did the rhythmic displacement do? It brought up the silence. He was known for playing his music in between the cracks, meaning there are possibilities in the frets that we ignore. And that's how Monk played his music. Again, I'm skipping forward here. Now, the thing that I really want to highlight, and I'll close with this, as I said, Monk played in the tension. Catch that word, play. That comes from a ritual tradition among African Americans called capital P play. That means that in some ways, there's a kind of ritualism in our lives through play that informs our work. In German, they use the term Erlösung, which has to do with this idea of a loosening or relaxing. It's sort of like Jesus' burden being light. And I always tell my friends, it's not the play or the work that informs play. It's play, a certain kind of play, that informs our work. Our problem is we tend to focus on degree rather than kind. And I'm convinced that if we can open up our minds to the hedgehog, the fox, and the rabbit, we can learn to play too. Thank you.
The International Colloquium Series, confronting global issues with moral clarity and intellectual depth.